Hi, everyone. This is episode 3 in our series on who were the Nicolaitans in Revelation chapter 2. And in this episode, the subtitle is Does Paul Teach a Christian Can Eat Meat Sacrificed to Idols? And to remind ourselves, we're talking about Revelations chapter 2, verses 6, 14, and 15, where Jesus mentions the Nicolaitans as ones endorsing eating meat sacrificed to idols. We are talking about events that have occurred in Asia. If you see here on the map, it's not Asia in China. Asia was a province in Western Turkey that was belonged to the Romans, and they called it Asia. Sometimes it's also called Asia Minor. And right across the Aegean Sea here in this map, you can see that's where Greece is, and that would be where Athens and places like that are. To the right of Asia, to the east of Asia, you have Galatia, just so you have frame of reference. By now, if any of you have been seeing episodes 1 and 2, you will automatically be thinking, has anyone else besides Doug thought the book of Revelation is anti-Paul? Well, we showed you Renan did, but how about more mainstream Christian authors? Well, one of the most mainstream is Ezra Palmer Gould of a different era, but he would have be considered, like, I don't want to say... but all the people, R.C. Sproul, people who are very well known for writing books, very orthodox, very normal. And what does he say? Ezra Palmer Gould, in a book entitled The Biblical Theology of the New Testament, Macmillan, 1900, unhappily admits the apocalypse, which nowadays we only call Revelation, written by Apostle John, represents an unqualified opposition to Paul. The apocalypse is anti-Pauline. That's at page 125. Revelation is a writing distinctly anti-Pauline, page 131. And I could go on. So he is very well aware of what we're showing you, but you're never allowed to see it, and you're never allowed to be told it. And you're going to see you're treated like petted fools. And I'm going to show you a commentary on one of the verses we're going to talk about today. So let's go on. Now, just to remind ourselves, where is Jesus's predicate? What is he relying upon to condemn the deeds and the doctrines of the Nicolaitans? And we will get into, again, what that word Nicolaitans means, but to be just succinctly, it says it's an Aramaic term mocking people, saying, let us be eating anything we want. Let us be eaters, is what it literally is only saying. And therefore, it's not about a guy named Nicholas and his followers and all that. Anyway, this all gets back to Acts chapter 15, verses 20, 29, and Acts 21, 25, where 3 times James, the bishop of Jerusalem, is talking about the principles of what the Gentiles must absolutely not do. And one of them is eat meat sacrificed to idols. And we have them here, and we've reviewed them last time. And so here's the first verse, just to remind ourselves what Jesus said in Revelation 2, verse 6. But this thou, i.e., he's talking to the Ephesians, have in your favor that thou hatest the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Again, this is about Ephesus. You see them on the map right there. Then verse 14 of Revelation, but I have a few things against you, because you hold them that you have them there that hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornication. That was the doctrine of Balaam, that who taught Balak these things. So Jesus obviously condemning clearly eating meat sacrificed to idols in that situation. Verse 15, so have you also them that hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. So Jesus hates the doctrine and the deeds of the Nicolaitans we established last time. All right, so does Paul teach, here's our heading, does Paul teach it is okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols? The answer is yes. Let's listen to what he says in 1 Corinthians 8, verses 4 to 12. And he's going to do it again in 1 Corinthians 10. So don't make up your mind whether you think what this says or not till you see the whole picture. Okay, so from the KJV, as concerning therefore the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other God but one. But meat commends us not to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. But take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours becomes a stumbling block to them that are weak. For if any man see thee which has knowledge sit at meat in the idol's temple. So if anyone sees you eating at the idol's temple. Now I'm going to pause there and just let you know, I don't think Paul means to say you can go to he's going to allow you to do this with a caveat. So he's not saying you can go to the sacrifice time. There's after the sacrifice is over, the standard practice in these temples was to allow the people to eat the meat sacrificed to idols subsequently after the service is over. And so this would be a free option for anyone to come in and just have free meat. But it is meat sacrificed to an idol. So he's talking about this. For if any man see that thee which has knowledge sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. But when you sin so against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. And finally, Paul will conclude in 8:13. Wherefore, if meat makes my brother to offend, meaning to sin, I will eat no flesh while the world stands, lest I make my brother to offend, my brother to sin. So, around someone who has a weak conscience, while you have a strong conscience, he has a weak conscience that an idol is something. And so, if he sees you at the sacrifice altar, sacrifice temple, eating meat sacrificed idols, you can cause your brother to fall. Okay? Does he say you cannot eat meat sacrificed to idols? No. He actually is clearly saying you can, unless somebody sees you who is a Christian brother, and also someone who isn't as enlightened as you are and is weak rather than strong like you, and he would be led to think it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols, even though yet he thinks an idol is a really something thing, and therefore that means he's now doing something evil. So it's not evil, but he doesn't have this awareness yet, is what it is. Paul is saying he has this higher knowledge, this deep thing of God, is what he says in 1 Corinthians 2. He has the deep things of God, and this is teaching Paul that he can eat meat sacrificed to idols safely because he knows an idol is not actually anything. So why didn't the apostles tell that to in Acts 15? Why didn't they just say, an idol is nothing, so you can eat meat sacrificed idols if you assure and teach them an idol is nothing to worry about. It's a nothing burger. But they don't do that. They say, tell them not to eat it at all, because to them it's a moral question, and it's a moral question to Jesus, obviously, in chapter 2 of Revelation. So now I want someone to comment on this that you can appreciate something else about this whole passage, and his name is Obadiah Johnson. We'll listen to what he has to say. Okay, Obadiah Johnson, in his book, Pharisee Paul, Apostle or Deceiver, 2014, on iBooks. I recommend that if you have iBooks. And he writes this. In 1 Corinthians 8, verses 4 to 12, Paul is clearly implying that since there is only one God, an idol is nothing in the world. He goes on to claim that the meat or food we eat does not bring us closer to Elohim or alienate us from him. He, Paul, finally implies that knowledgeable believers in Adonai Yahushua, that's those people who have gnosis or deep things of knowledge of God, have the, quote, liberty to sit in the idol's temple eating food sacrificed to the idol as long as a weaker fellow believers don't see them doing this. According to Pharisee Paul, it is wrong to eat food sacrificed to idols even in the temple of the idols only if the idolater is seen doing this by weaker believers. And I'd be a little careful there. See, so he may have misspoke there. I wouldn't say Paul is an idolater. He's not at the temple worshiping. He's not recommending that. And so we need to distinguish between eating at the temple, which you're allowed to eat, anyone can eat, but you don't necessarily participate in the worship service. Anyway, but his points are still valid. Otherwise, it would be perfectly acceptable? ? And I would say this, I wouldn't even, out of just mere appearances, as a Christian, what kind of message am I sending to idolaters if I eat meat sacrificed to idols in the temple, even though it's after the service is over? That still seems to me to be a much more material issue about whether they see me eating meat or not. It's like they're seeing me sitting there eating at the temple. That's, to me, the wrong example that a good Christian should never give, and that's the problem I think that maybe Obadiah should have made that point a little more emphatic rather than this issue about whether Paul was an idolater. Clearly, he's saying giving a bad example of being at the temple is not the issue. It's if they see you eating meat sacrificed to idols and the other person has a weak conscience, and you know that, and you know they think eating meat they think an idol is something, then he's going to recommend you refrain. But let's continue. This is clearly condoning what Adonai Yahushua condemns in Revelation 2:14. That's correct. Why did Pharisee Paul condone the eating of foods offered to idols against the will of our Savior Adonai Yahushua? Good point. Now, I want to show you how this passage is whitewashed by standard Protestant mainstream commentators. They acknowledge that Paul does allow you to eat meat sacrificed to idols, but they also try to make a big deal that he wanted you to have this tenderness towards other people. So let's just listen to Cambridge Bible for schools and college just to see why nobody gets up an alarm about a passage that is extremely obviously condemned by Jesus. They abstain from pollution of idols. This is explained in Acts 15, verse 29, by meats offered to idols. So their understanding is identical concept as was prohibited is now being condemned by Jesus Christ. So it's not a surprise, right? Of the necessity for such an injunction in the early church where congregations were to be now composed of both Jews and Gentiles, we can judge from St. Paul's argument to the Corinthians. This is in 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 10, and we're looking at both passages. And we can also see how he would have the Gentile converts deal tenderly with the scruples of their Jewish fellow worshippers. Now, what he seems to be saying is no other Gentile would have this scruple that an idol is something. It would be actually a Jewish believer. So in front of a Jewish believer, you wouldn't sit at the idol temple and eat, making them of a weak conscience because they think an idol is something. They think eating idol meat is wrong morally. But it's not wrong morally because an idol is nothing. So what this commentator is saying is that Paul is telling us, Christians who are Gentile, yeah, we know that the idol is really nothing, but the Jewish person doesn't know this yet. So in front of them, we won't eat idol meat when we're at the idol's temple. And I have to say this: if I were Peter and I saw a Christian Gentile eating at the idol temple, I don't care what he's eating. He shouldn't be at the idol temple in the first place. But Paul doesn't seem to have any scruple about that at all. Not even a question mark about that. That's okay to be at the idol temple. But I digress. Anyway, however, needless they themselves might deem such scruples. So the Gentile does not need to have any scruples about it. And that's what they're saying. So just you should only have scruples if a Jewish believer is around you, sees you, and they have a weak conscience, you have a strong conscience, you can eat such meat, but they think you can't. Well, these Jewish fellow worshipers are following the 12 apostles who made a decision in Acts 15 that Paul was right there and present. He should have obeyed it. He should not be teaching contrary to it. This is many, many years later, by the way. This is way past. This is around 50. This is several years after the Jerusalem conference was just spoken about in Galatians chapter 2, and that's in 47 AD, and the book of Corinthians is many years after Galatians. So this is clearly Paul just disregarding the instructions. He's just not following the instructions he was given, just as James suspected he wouldn't, and that's why he had to send these two other messengers with him, as we mentioned in one of the prior episodes in this series. Now, let's go look at 1 Corinthians 10, verses 25 to 29. Same type situation, similar conclusion, but it's even worse. And even more blunt when you get to the end here, that it's totally okay. The last thing he says is it's totally okay. And a lot of people don't read to the very end. And so I'm going to make sure you read with me to the very end. Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So he's taking this verse about everything is the Lord's. You can eat anything you want. Okay? And that's not true. No, God tells you certain things are toxic. And look at Acts 15. If you follow this principle, all the other commandments about food, don't eat meat with the blood in it, don't eat meat that is an animal that has previously strangled, basically killed in an unmerciful way, and you shouldn't eat meat sacrificed to idols. He's just throwing these all out, but he completely knows about them. See, this is really where he's completely an apostate against even the 12. and the Bishop James. And now we can see Jesus speaking in Revelation chapter 2. Verse 27, if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience, meaning don't ask if it's idol meat. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. Now, don't read the next verse, because I had an interchange with a Protestant, Pauline Christian who didn't read the next verse. And he thought, see, Paul said, don't eat for the sake of the other person's conscience and for your own conscience. So now read the next verse with me. I'm referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. For why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? So let me show you this. So this is what James J. posts to me, and he says, in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 28, Paul says, not to eat things which are sacrificed to idols explicitly. But poor guy. Poor guy, I felt bad for him in a way. But now I'm going to read you the whole thing, but I said, you're reading only verse 20. Your reading of only verse 28 missed the key next verse. I am referring to the other's conscience, not yours. So in other words, Paul is 100% saying it's okay to meet sacrifice idols. And only if you blind yourself can you not see it. And you should not blind yourself, because you are testing Paul as God requires. And that's what you're supposed to do. That's why Paul is in the Bible, to see if you will be duped by someone who is not listening to Christ, not listening to the 12, and is being condemned by Jesus Christ, not by name, but by you having to put it together. If it was not intended as a test, Jesus would have told you who he's talking about. But he's deliberately not telling you who he's talking about. So you will apply a test. Now, now we're going to, so that's it. That's the idol meat passage. And now I'm just going to review with you some of what we've assembled so far in the prior 2 episodes, just so we can start piecing it all together. And we had Robertson telling you that the Nicolaitans were early Gnostics, people who believed that gnosis was salvific. But that's clearly Paul, by the way. You might not understand that Paul is a Gnostic, but he is. When we condemn the Gnostics for teaching secret knowledge gets you salvation, nobody wants to point at Paul, but that's the same thing he teaches in 1 Corinthians 15:1-4. If you believe in the facts of the death of Jesus Christ, the burial of Jesus Christ, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you shall be saved. If you keep it steadfastly in mind, that is Gnosticism, pure and simple. And then it says, these early Gnostics, or people who believed in special knowledge, practiced licentiousness. Well, this is license. Paul is saying, I can do something that is prohibited in God's law, prohibited by Bishop James and the 12, and I was there. I can't deny it. I don't care. I'm going to permit it. I'm going to tell people you can eat it if you want, as long as nobody's around who worries about this issue and as a conscience about it. And I'm going to accuse them of having a weak conscience. I have the strong conscience. I'm Paul. I'm all good. I know what I'm doing. That's what he's saying, and he is definitely giving himself license to do something he's not supposed to. And then it says the reason is they were not under law. So clearly Paul doesn't believe he has to obey God's law about this, and there's law practices about not killing meat to an idol, and then not even eating the meat to an idol. And if someone invites you over to their house, the danger is you might eat, if you're in a community where you let temples exist with idol meat, there's always the possibility you could go sit down and eat meat, and then eat meat sacrificed to idols. So basically tear down their temples. God was against even inadvertent eating it, just in that passage alone. And we go through this in our book, Jesus' Words Only. But so they're not under law, but are under grace. Well, who else is this about? So Robertson is just using common sense reading this text, but he's mainstream as it gets. He's a Baptist University professor. He's a Baptist himself. He's got every kind of letter for doctorates after his name. And we showed you last time that or in the first episode, that Nicholas is not the name of the head of this group. It's some second century Christian commentators tried to claim. It's actually obvious what it is when you know Aramaic. Jesus spoke Aramaic, many words, and we went through that. And Nicola in Aramaic means let us eat. And so the Greek word was a plural formed from that Aramaic term and means let us. They're people who would be lettuce eaters. This is a crop from this article by Dr. Eli Lazorkin Eisenberg in his article, Who Were the Nicolaitans, in the Israel Bible Weekly. This is a a website, by the way, that has tremendous academic credentials as Christians, Protestants. They are Hebraic Jews, or they teach Hebraic principles as if they were Jews, and maybe some of them aren't all Jews, and they actually charge for some of their courses, but they give a lot of their content away for free. So it's a very good web service to learn about. And now we talked to you about how Jesus mocks or says the Nicolaitans are using the words of James against following God's law, where it says, here's where James is actually concluding his sentence in Acts 15. He says, "For it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay upon you no greater burden than these necessary things." He's addressing Gentiles in this letter. "That you abstain from meats offered to idols, and from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication, from which you keep yourselves, you shall do well, fare ye well." So if you take this out of context, you can give yourself permission to do anything you want. You lay no greater burden than X, Y, and Z. In context, would be these things don't go out the window. But if you don't refer to that, you can make it sound like we were given nothing, depending on what you claim the Jerusalem conference actually concluded. Let's say you told people, well, it was all about not eating things that were strangled, and that's all you say. And then the message you're giving is that the 12 told us we're not laying any other greater burden on you, and then omitting also that this was only a temporary thing. It means it was an emergency resolution of some key issues. And then James goes on to say that you will hear more of the law each week as you go every week, as the law is read every Sabbath. Obviously intending Christians to attend Sabbath, which, by the way, implies one command he was obviously assuming every Christian would follow, which is keeping Sabbath, contrary to your teaching of your church that became a Sunday worship church. That was not original. And we reviewed Revelation 2:24, where this is, scholars even agree that Paul is being quoted here in a mocking way when it talks about the depths of Satan. But because of the King James adding a semicolon, where I point, if you look over there as they speak, and it's got the red thing, that semicolon doesn't exist because there is no punctuation in Greek. So if you just ignore that, you'll see what it really says. "But I say unto you, and unto the rest of Thyatira," this is another church, "as many as have not this doctrine," meaning of eating meat sacrificed to idols, "and which have not known the depths of Satan." What did Paul teach us? Paul teaches us a mystery, a hidden mystery, which God ordained before the world unto glory, and God has revealed unto us by his Spirit, meaning this. Remember I mentioned what Gnosticism is? God has given you some superior knowledge that other people don't have. It's a mystery that others don't have, but we have. Our little group here. "For the Spirit searches all things, yea, the deep things of God," the bathe, B-A-T-H-E, and if you go back, that's the same word here, deep things of Satan. And so Jesus is understood by scholars who are pro-Paul that is possibly what he's saying, and others who are just more honest and still pro-Paul, like Renan, say that's exactly what this is. The words are put in Jesus' mouth here to mock Paul. And if you read the next sentence and you realize there's no punctuation, then read it. "And which have not known." Okay, let's go back here. "But unto you I say, and unto the rest in Thyatira, as many as have not this doctrine, and which have not known the depths of Satan, as they say, I will put upon you no other burden." So this is where Jesus is not saying, I won't put any other burden on you. Like what? Just not eating meat sacrificed to idols? Is he throwing the other three principles out? I just read you from Acts. No, he's mocking, quoting these people from the Nicolaitans who were saying, we're not going to put any other burden on you, meaning we're going to give you like virtually nothing to do. And Jesus is mocking this whole idea. Let us eat whatever we want. And they're telling you there's no other burden. Then what? Nothing, because they're denying these principles even are true. All right, we've already reviewed that. And Renan, I just want to read this to you. This was his book in 1871. It was a series called History of Christianity, and he had volume 3 was St. Paul. And I mentioned to you more about this, that at first he's defending Paul, viciously attacking the 12, viciously attacking John for writing the book of Revelation as filled with hate. And so he's going to make this admission of what the purpose was of using the word depths of Satan, to actually quote Paul. So the first person to see this wasn't the people who were the IVP commentary, just for an example, says this is a possibly referring, Jesus is possibly quoting Paul in 1 Corinthians 2:10, and Renan is just clear about it. So let's just read what Renan says. According to all the writings of the early church, including James, Jude, and the book of Revelation, he puts them all together in a synthesis, and then he says from that synthesis, he says, in this group of writings, Paul was the frivolous man of whom the Gentiles had received the doctrine which is opposed to the law. His visions, which he calls depths of God, they qualified as the depths of Satan. His churches they named the synagogues of Satan. In spite of Paul, they proclaim boldly that the 12 are the foundation of the church of Christ. So remember, the book of Revelation also says there's only 12 apostles, in the foundation of the Jerusalem church is the 12 pillars of the city of Jerusalem are the 12 pillars, the 12 apostles. So that excluded Paul, and he's saying, see, this is just Revelation is just this big anti-Paul work. And yeah, I mean, who else teaches you can eat meat sacrificed to idols? And Jesus would be mocking them by saying they teach the depths of Satan, not the depths of God. Here is the IVP commentary. We reviewed this last time. They are pointing out that 1 Corinthians 2:10 does appear to be what Jesus is referring to, possibly. Renan is certain of it. They're just admitting it's possible. Depends how what do you see? It's all about what are you willing to allow Jesus to test you on? Are you willing to let Jesus force you to test Paul? Will you test Paul? So this is helping you, I think, to realize even people who are pro Paul have to admit certain things. And here, what does it say? Possibly with Paul's statement in view in 1 Corinthians 2:10, the risen Jesus announces not just to Thyatira, but to all the churches, verse 23, that I am he who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each of you according to your deeds, your works. See, that's another reference back to the faith versus works thing. So again, you can just see the underscoring of James's principles are in Jesus' mouth here, adding that the deep things of such groups as this are not the profound truths of God, but the deep secrets, or bate, the depths of Satan himself, verse 24. So again, what is he talking about? Possibly with Paul's statement in view, which was what? Where God has revealed to us, I have it up here at the top, by his Spirit, and the Spirit searches all things, even the depths, or bate, of God. So this commentary is linking the two together. Let's see what else we have here. And then we've already shown you that Jesus was alluding to the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 15 at the council, the Jerusalem council, where they said, we're going to give you these four things right now. Right now, we're going to put no other burdens on you. James then says, but each week you're going to hear the law read as it has been forever, from generations past, and on every Sabbath. So he doesn't have to give you everything all at once. He's just giving you these four for now. All right, and here are the passages that involve pollution or the sacrifice to idols referenced in Acts and prohibited. All right, and just a brief review of our prior episodes on the issue of whether this happened to Paul or not. The events were referred to in about a trial, about being declared a false apostle at Ephesus, and so on and so forth. So let's just review some of that evidence. This is Revelation chapter 2. Unto the angel of the church of Ephesus write these things. Verse 2. I know your works and your labor and your patience, and how you canst not bear them who are evil, and you have tried them which say they are apostles and are not, and have found them liars. In the very same context, they reject the message of eating meat sacrificed to idols. So there seems to be a link to Paul when you study a little further. We previously discussed in Acts 19, verses 1 to 4, and then 8 to 10, where Paul is inside of a synagogue that is Jewish, but he then, over 3 months' time, he leads many to become Christians, and then he takes some away to be start up a discipleship outside of this synagogue. He was obviously expelled, because it says the leadership started to call him, believe that he was teaching a false way. Okay, so that doesn't mean they were not Christians. It's just simply they rejected Paul. So don't equate rejecting Paul with meaning you rejected the messages you're receiving. So over 3 months, they could have actually written off a message to Jerusalem to say, "Hey, can you give us some backup on this stuff? What's he saying?" Because they might have known who the Christian church leaders were. And this is the church that this synagogue became a church or a fellowship within Christendom. So anyway, that seems to be the case because Paul will talk about this event. Now that that synagogue is in Asia, right? It's in Ephesus, and many have come to believe in Christ through Paul's words. So Paul can speak the words of Christ, can speak the messages, whatever that lead people to Christ. And also, he brought with him 10 I think it was 10 converts from John the Baptist into the congregation when he started. So he had people who already knew Christ and knew of his message, but didn't get baptized yet into the name of Christ. And so he baptizes them into the name of Christ. But that doesn't mean they don't know about Christ. So he may have had all these extra allies, people who actually knew Jesus personally, who would be able to help convert the people in this particular synagogue. So maybe he got a special blessing from all of that contact. Anyway, here's what Paul says in 2 Timothy 1, verse 15. This thou knowest, that all they which are in Asia, capital is Ephesus, be turned away from me, of whom are Phygellus and Hermogenes. And then Paul talks about losing a trial there. He'll mention he put on a defense, and then he loses, but he doesn't get killed, apparently. Let me read this to you. 2 Timothy 4:14 to 17. Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. The Lord will render him according to his works, of whom do you also beware. For he greatly withstood our words. At my first defense, no one took my part, but all forsook me. May it not be laid to their account, but I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. So he's not killed, but he loses, and everyone forsakes him because the decision was so determinative of his invalidity. That's the only thing that can explain that. All right. And then in the prior episode, we showed you Christian scholar Renan in at page 220 completely accepts everything we're saying applies to Paul, and that the words of Jesus are all aimed at Paul in the book of Revelation, and is so clear and so obvious to him that he concludes, since Paul is valid, we must conclude everything that we're hearing supposedly from Jesus is really all John venting his hatred at Paul. So he concludes John the apostle is a hater of Paul the person, not of his deeds, not of his works, but just simply hates Paul and wants him to be delegitimized. And so he sees it as obvious, and it is obvious once you look at all the pieces. But he eventually converts to what we call the Jesus words only principle, and I want to show you how he converted. And let's start where it starts here. I persist. I persist, therefore, and this is page 330. So page 220, he's totally pro Paul, totally on board with Paul. And then watch how he changes here. I persist, therefore, in thinking that the part taken by Paul in the creation of Christianity should be ranked far below that of Jesus. According to my opinion, Paul should even occupy a position beneath Francis of Assisi and the author of The Limitation, both of whom saw Jesus in close proximity. The Son of God stands alone. To appear for a moment, to reflect the soft and profound refulgence, to die very young, is the life of a god. I suppose he believes Jesus is God. To struggle, dispute, and conquer is the life of a man. Oh, okay. After having been for 3 centuries, thanks to Orthodox Protestantism, the Christian teacher par excellence, Paul sees in our day his reign drawing to a close. Praise God if that's true. Jesus, on the contrary, lives more than ever. Praise God, if that will be true. It is no longer the epistle to the Romans, which is the resume of Christianity. It is the Sermon on the Mount. True Christianity, which will last forever, comes from the Gospels, not from the epistles of Paul. The writings of Paul have been a danger and hidden rock, the causes of the principal defects of Christian theology. Paul is the father of the subtle Augustine, of the unfruitful Thomas Aquinas, of the gloomy Calvinist, of the peevish Jansenist, of the fierce theology which damns and predestinates, etc., etc., etc. All right, so this is as complete and as radical a change as you can imagine. And like I said in my prior episodes, if there had been word processing, what would he have done here? He might have had to throw all his book away, but you know what he decided to do? He would have left it all there. He just left it on the table, so you can see he went through this catharsis where he's totally vilifying John over the book of Revelation, vilifying Jude, vilifying James. I mean, I didn't even tell you all the other stuff he was vilifying, just heaping on them, attributing them to all kinds of evil motives and hatred of Paul. I mean, it just goes on and on from page 180 to 220. So we're talking about 40 solid pages of complete hostile, anti James, anti the Jesus of Revelation, anti John, anti Jude. I mean, just terrible, terrible things he's saying and attributing to them. And then here he flips over completely at the end. So that tells you something. He had a change of heart. He tested the word of God. He ended up realizing it is the word of God. He ended up flipping 180 degrees over it by the end. Isn't that great? And so I think Renan is a hero to everybody of the Jesus Words Only movement. Yes, you can face and look at all these things, but you know what? The best evidence of how you become, what will lead you, Paulinist, to Christ. I'm going to tell you for a fact how I know what it will be. Luther went through the same process. My friends who are Paul fans. Now, he read the book of Galatians. It's that book that converted Luther from Paulinism back to Jesusism, following Jesus. All you have to do is read the Antinomian Theses. You'll see where he goes back to Jesus. But if you read his epistle right before that, I mean, not his epistle, his sermon right before that was the book of Galatians. Book of Galatians is so emphatic that the law is not even given by God. It's given by angels through a mediator. And if you want to obey Sabbath, you're seeking to be in bondage again to the weak and beggarly celestial beings. And Paul in Galatians talks negatively about the apostles. He calls them super apostles and false apostles, and Luther's all on board. His commentary says he's talking about the 12. He realizes the 12 are trying to abridge his gospel, and Luther is still on board with this faith alone gospel. Then something snaps. See, when you finally put it in writing, summarize the book of Galatians. That's what I'm going to try to tell you. Summarize and research Revelation chapter 2. That's what I would tell every Paulinist. You want to test God? Test it this way. Summarize the book of Galatians, summarize the book of Revelation chapter 2. That's what you got to do. And see if you can defend everything there is all about everything in Revelation is a book of lies, and everything that Paul says about the law given by angels, not by God Moses, and instead it was given by weak and beggarly angels. Read that. And will you walk away saying Paul is speaking for God? That's number one. That's Galatians. Can you really say that in your heart? That the law was not given by Moses, was given by angels. And can you, with the other side of your brain, go look at the book of Revelation and say, Jesus did not actually say any of these things. And this critique is all a hostile, angry expression by John, using Jesus as a tool. If you can say that's what you have to do, you have to defend these positions because there's no other way. The only way to go to heaven is you have to have a plausible argument that Revelation 2 isn't about Paul and negatively about Paul for real, and you have to believe that the book of Galatians is from God. If you can convince yourself and God and of either of these both propositions, then God might give you a chance, even if you're wrong. But if you can't prove either one of those propositions are true to yourself, to your own self be true, then you need to convert and do exactly what Renan did. Read this again and read and absorb everything Renan said and say, that's how I'm going to live from now on. And he said it right. The ascendancy of Christ is happening again. Christians are finally being reborn in the modern era. And it really began with Renan. God bless you. Take care. Bye.